Hi, my name is Maris Kreisman and I run events and marketing at McNally Jackson, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event for the store. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs we're hosting in the coming weeks. Please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear about what's coming soon. There will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions, so start thinking now. You can use the Zoom chat function at any time to submit a question, and we'll get to them towards the end of the evening. We're glad that even though we can't all be in the same room at the moment, we're still able to host events during this difficult time. As we've changed phases from staying at home to opening for curbside pickup to again admitting customers into our 4 locations, indie bookstores like ours still need more support. And so if you enjoy free events like this and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. Throughout the evening, I will be posting links in the chat to buy W-3. We are so pleased to celebrate the publication of W-3 by a public space of the new edition of the 1974 memoir by Bette Howland, the author of the acclaimed collection Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage. So thrilled tonight to welcome Brigid Hughes. She's the editor of the Brooklyn-based literary magazine A Public Space, which she founded in 2006. And I really enjoyed reading the glowing New York Times review of W-3 and the story of how she came to discover the book. But I think I'll let Laurie tell you about that. Also thrilled to have Yiyun Li. She was born and raised in Beijing and came to the US in 1996. She's the author of 6 works of fiction and the memoir, Dear Friend, From My Life I Write to You in Your Life, all from Random House. She is also an editor at Public Space, and she has written the intro for this new edition of W-3. And I'm also delighted to have Laurie Muchnick here to moderate. She is the fiction editor of Kirkus Reviews, and so glad to have you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Maris. It's so nice to be here to talk about Bette Howland, who for me was such an exciting discovery. So thank you to Brigid for discovering her for all of us. Bette Howland was the single mother of 2 young boys, making a living as a librarian and editor when she took an overdose of sleeping pills in 1968. She quickly had a change of heart and called her doctor, leaving a message with his answering service. Fortunately, when the doctor couldn't reach her, he called the police, and Howland woke up 3 days later in intensive care. There was one unusual detail. Howland was in Saul Bellow's apartment when she took those pills. They'd met at a writers' conference sometime earlier and become friends and sometimes lovers, and she was house sitting for him while he was traveling. In W-3, which is a memoir of the year she spent on in the psychiatric ward of a Chicago hospital, she focuses less on herself than on the people around her, carefully cataloging the quirks, habits, clothes, and obsessions of the other patients, but not really the doctors or staff, who she quickly realized weren't the most important part of their community. W-3 was published in 1974 and was followed fairly quickly by 2 more books, Blue in Chicago in 1978 and Things to Come and Go in 1983. Howland won a MacArthur Genius Grant in 1984, and it seems that she might have developed some kind of imposter syndrome, feeling like anything she wrote after that would reveal she wasn't worthy of it. She did write a brilliant novella, Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, which appeared in Tri-Quarterly in 1999, but she didn't publish any more books. Then a few years ago, Brigid bought a copy of W-3 from the $1 cart at Housing Works, I think it was Housing Works, is that right? Mm-hmm. And set off a revival of Howland's career. Brigid, could you start us off by just telling us, how you found the book and what, you thought when you first read it, and just tell us the story from there?
Sure. Thank you so much, Maris, and everyone at McNally Jackson for inviting us to have this event, and Laurie and Yiyun for helping to celebrate Bette tonight. So this book sort of traces back a few years ago to a summer afternoon when I was browsing in Housing Works in those what feel like long ago days when you could do such things. And they have this section towards the front of the store, this cart of books for sale for $1, sort of their last stop before they're about to be pulped. And who knows why that day there was this cover with this neon green title that just sort of caught my eye. And I pulled it out, and it had a blurb on the back of it by Saul Bellow. And that was it. I opened up to sort of a random page and was just struck by the writing. And I thought, well, I've never heard of this writer, Bette Howland. So I paid the $1 and I brought it home. And sort of there it is, sort of the little $1 ticket still there. And sort of as you think, these days, got home, read some more of the book, and Googled to sort of figure out more about her, and couldn't find anything. And it was just one of those things where the harder she was to find, the more determined I sort of became to track her down. And sort of the staff at a public space sort of set to work. We put on our sleuth hats and spent a few weeks researching with very, very little luck. Until one day we found in an obituary for someone who turned out to be her grandmother, a mention of a son that she had, who was a professor of philosophy in Oklahoma. And so we sent an email to him saying, is your mother Bette Howland the author? He wrote back the next day, said yes. And we'd asked, is she still writing? And he said, well, I know that she has some stories and papers in a safe deposit box, and I'll go tomorrow and see what I can find. And he emailed the next day and said he'd found these essays and these short stories, and also this collection of letters and postcards from Saul Bellow. Might we be interested? And yes, in fact, we were. So that was sort of the beginning, and we put together a portfolio of all of this in an issue of the magazine that was looking at this generation of women writers and artists, and this sort of question of women who'd worked sort of very much apart from the mainstream for any number of reasons. And then sort of wanted to bring her books back into print, and that in many ways inspired the launch of a Public Space Books and the publication of W-3 now.
It's so fascinating to me that her son had no idea what she had in there.
I mean, he knew that she was writing. Even after the MacArthur, she'd always continued writing, I think. She just hadn't really participated in the publishing side of it.
And is there more, or are the things that you published in Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, which is the collection of her fiction that you published?
Yeah, I think that there are bits and pieces of more. I don't know how much. One of the things, because she's no longer with us, that you would have the decisions that you would have to make as an editor is this the draft or is this a finished piece?
Right.
So there are manuscripts around, and we did put some of the unpublished stories in the first collection.
Right. So Yiyun, how did you get involved in this publication? And would you like to read a bit of your introduction for us?
Right. Yes. My entire participation is really just to enjoy. I feel that I'm just benefiting from Brigid and her staff's work. I just love Bette Howland's. I was reading the book today again. I was in awe, and I thought, I wish I could write like that. And so I wrote the introduction. I'm just going to read one page, but before that, I just want to say I wrote the introduction after I read the book the first time, and then today and yesterday, this week, I've been reading the book again. I wish I'd had this thought earlier when I was writing the introduction. Today I was thinking, this is just like a version of Alice in the Wonderland. It's Bette Howland, went into a nightmare instead of a good dream like Alice, but she literally fell into a dream, and she woke up again in the hospital with all these people who seemed both strange and familiar. Like, you could almost go into the book and see the dormouse, the mock turtle, and all these characters from Alice in the Wonderland you could see in the book. So I thought, wow, that's a very good, I really enjoyed this time.
And the book even starts with her waking up in the hospital. She doesn't know where she is. She just hears this sound. It is very Alice in Wonderland.
Very much so. So I will just read the first page of this introduction. A few years ago, before I left a psychiatric hospital in New York, the doctor who signed off on my release said to me, "You can write about your time here as long as you don't name the hospital." How mad, I thought then, would I have to be to write about this? What this was, I didn't want to articulate. I had set my heart to not remember, which, to my mind, was different from forgetting. To forget would be disloyalty to my profession. To not remember felt like a necessity for writing and for living. Reading W-3, Bette Howland's memoir about her stay in the Chicago psychiatric ward, I had a sense of reliving memory. Temporal and geographical setting matter little in the eternal struggle between lucidity and lunacy. The characters in W-3 could be the same people I encountered in S6, the ward where I stayed, the loquacious and the wordless, the violent and the frozen, those who believed themselves to be unfairly locked up, and those who celebrated their readmissions with fanfare. The unmistakable divides between races and classes, where a patient came from and would return to, New York City or the suburbs, Manhattan or the other boroughs, an African-American neighborhood or a Haitian-American neighborhood in Brooklyn, a homeless shelter or halfway home, or one with a secure and private roof. Another patient told me that every one of us had a book to write after leaving the hospital. "Call it Women Interrupted," she said. No one, I thought, would be omniscient enough, lucid enough, selfless enough to write that book. What is in one's possession contains one's blind spot, luck, suffering, desire, misgiving, the wish to rewrite, revise, restart a life, the wish to withdraw and to depart. And of course, our egos, vulnerable and recalcitrant. Preoccupied with our individual concerns, we forget that we're not that different from one another. That was the trouble. This is Bette Howland's writing. That was the trouble. There was no novelty. One gesture was stale, powerless, and unoriginal as the next. Nothing was original on W-3. That was its truth and beauty. I'm going to stop there, and there's a little bit more. So
That's so great. This book, A Public Space, has now published 2 of Howland's books, and the first one was labeled fiction, and this one, W-3, is labeled memoir, but they're very similar. In many of the stories in Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, there's a first-person narrator who sounds very much like Howland, and in one of the stories, she's named. Someone speaks to her and addresses her as Betty, and which I don't even think ever happens in her actual memoir. You know, what do you think it makes a difference to how we see the books, whether they're labeled fiction or nonfiction? You know, this book could easily have been called a novel, and I think people would have accepted that. I wonder, you know, what you think about how she saw her. I mean, it's hard to speak for her, but, you know, maybe how she decided to label things, and also how we then take them in as readers, depending on the label.
Brigid?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about how Bette Howland thought about both of those books from material that she left behind. So Blue in Chicago was her first story collection, and it's part of what we published within Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage. And she did an interview when that book came out. And when that book came out, depending on the review that you read, it was described as a collection of short stories, a novel, personal essays. And the interviewer asks, how do you think about that? And she says, oh, they're asking the wrong question. The question isn't about invention. The question is about imagination. And she goes on to say, imagination is the only way of experiencing life. And so I've always had that in my mind as sort of how to think about her work, that it's about imagination. But in a letter that she wrote to her editor for W-3, in response to sort of an editorial query about what is this book that you've written, she does define it as nonfiction and says that it's important to her that she did not invent anything, that everything that she records was what she heard or what she saw, and that she says her role was to discover, not to impose on the lives of these characters. But I'm curious for Yiyun, because you've written both fiction and nonfiction, sort of how you think about what those categories mean.
Yes, it's so interesting because Laurie, when you said, you can call this a novel, and it's a novel too, it's her decision. But I do feel there's a slight difference between her first person narrator in her fiction and in this book. I think, it's funny, I didn't realize her stories can also be called, personal essays. Those are really, I think those stories have a very strong first person narrator, and you're aware of that first person narrator. And W-3 is, is a little different. I think Brigid said I think Betty's clearly set her goal to observe and to listen to other people, to look at other people. I was thinking today, I thought, the only person who's largely absent in that book is Bette Howland, the narrator. And why did she do that? I feel that, I think that's the difference between her fiction and nonfiction, is in her nonfiction, that absence, the absence of that first person narrator. I was just thinking, I think partly it's the setting. It's a hospital. It's a hospital setting. It's such an enclosed space with so many different stories. Every patient had a narrative, and many of them compete to have their narratives heard or seen or known. And Betty, I think Betty the narrator really sort of, I think help me out, Brigid, if you need, but I do think she created a negative space for herself. So everybody is present, everybody's on the front, and you can follow all the patient stories, all their backstories, and all these quirks they have on the ward. And in the end, I think all these characters together, they sort of, that negative space is where Betty is. And I think that's probably a little different from her fiction, where that negative space, I think as a first person narrator in her fiction, still comes through as an active character. That makes sense.
That is interesting. It felt like, to me, in her short stories, her fiction, not every piece in Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, but a lot of them, they were, I read W-3 first, and then I read the short stories, and they're very, very Jewish to me, in a way like W-3 was not at all, really. Because in W-3, she was just observing everyone around her. In the fiction, she's observing people around her, but they're mostly her family, so they're Jewish. But the way she does it, she makes no sort of concession to the idea that you might not know what she's talking about. She sort of plunges the reader into a Jewish funeral or a Passover Seder, and uses shorthand for different ceremonies, doesn't really mind if you know what she's talking about, I think. Whereas in W-3, she's more like an anthropologist who's explaining as she goes along the strange rites of the ward and how everything works. I think because it's all new to her also. But I was just struck by that, the difference and between the fiction and the nonfiction, and what's, new to her and what's familiar to her. So they were very different, the two books, in spite of both being, I think, very autobiographical.
Yeah. I think wherever she is standing, whatever her perspective is, she shares that fully with you. And I find that hugely sort of generous of a writer and as a reader to say, I'm just going to let you in. I'm not going to explain something to you or feel that you need something defined. It immerses you in her world, whether it's the world of her family or it's this ward that's unfamiliar to her too. So you experience what she is experiencing. So I mean, I know that there's a distance in W-3, or that she's not writing about herself, but I find at the end of the book that I feel that I have, that I know her, or that I understand her, that I've sort of experienced this with her, and that's the way that you most know another person. I don't know, Yiyun, if you had that experience.
Yeah, just the part she wrote, she said nothing is original, and it's what Laurie said. She is actually, to W-3, she's new. Everything is new to her too. And yet I think somehow she recognized there's no original story, but there are a lot of unique expressions of this unoriginal story. And I think, I don't know her, I just imagine her just recording, because these expressions fascinated her. Like a patient would disrobe herself. It is a way to express your identity or your personality. But these things, I think the way she catches the uniqueness of all these unoriginal narratives, and then she sort of gathers them and presents them in a way. I also feel that the hospital is such an interesting structure, because nothing changes as a setting. The hospital is just there. Physically, it's going to be these people forever, and breakfast, lunch, dinner forever. Time doesn't really change either, because every day they do the same thing. They have these meetings and meetings and meetings. They have activities, but they're the same thing. So it's almost like time and space both stopped. And how do you exist in that? And I feel that maybe her way to do that is just to look at everyone again, and just sort of roaming view of like 50 people on the ward. And that I thought was interesting, because she doesn't have a shortcut as when she writes about her family. And I think somehow, I think she was able to use that lack of space-time change, and also lack of a familiarity with the material. But she was able to use that to set the book, and which worked really beautifully.
Brigid, would you like to read a bit?
Yeah, I thought maybe I'll just read a short section. This is from early in the book, when she's sort of getting a sense of the community. Let's see, what's a better way to do this? Rounds, that's a hospital word, part of the doctor's daily routine, checking up on all their patients. But this occurs to me only just now. Obviously, I didn't figure these things out right away. You figured nothing out, you accepted. At first, these words, names, everything seemed to be named, had a brash strangeness, the strangeness of the surroundings. The brashness perhaps in the mind, a bright, stunned state. Everything rang out audaciously, like solid brass. If you have swallowed a lethal dose of sleeping pills, your experience moves from the plane of the particular to the general. I didn't understand this yet. Still, the surroundings were strange all the same. Meetings? Why meetings in this place? This was the situation I had found myself in, my first morning on W-3, a newcomer, just delivered, sitting in the lounge and waiting for rounds to begin, clutching to my lap a little flat gray box of tissues, boxes distributed liberally all over the ward. Weeping was mightily encouraged here. I did not much feel like weeping, but wasn't so sure either that a sudden cloudburst might not overtake me. The prevailing winds being uncertain. I felt doubtful and uncertain about my appearance too. My arms and legs were covered with sinister bruises, and my hair had been clipped, shorn, skinned practically, like when I used to have lice as a child and got my head dunked in kerosene. I was wearing a short, bunchy housecoat of faded terry cloth and a pair of wide, gaping pink slippers. They were several sizes too large to begin with, and already well stretched with wear. Whose wear? I didn't know where these items had come from, but they were all I seemed to have. And I had been forewarned. On W-3, all inmates were expected to wear clothes. This had me worried, but it meant, apparently, anything that was not hospital garb, no uniforms. That did not make the disorderly assortment I saw around me any less drab. Patients in nightgowns, pajamas, robes, wigs, wraith-like in towels heavily draped over their heads, with sleepy, hanging faces, were finishing breakfast and reluctantly dragging chairs across the dining hall into the lounge. The plastic armchairs and sofas were already filling up. Doctors were seating themselves, parting the tails of their long white coats. While we waited, I contemplated my feet resentfully in the loose pink slippers. Perhaps once a month, an inmate turned up with a voice like mine, invariably an attempted suicide, who had spent several days in a coma in the intensive care unit before being transferred. Everyone knew what it meant. The coughing machine with its snorkels and seething mists rolled down the corridors, seeking me out. The coughing must have sounded like terminal agonies, like my voice. But inmates who had been around long enough recognized and accepted these peculiarities immediately. They nodded as soon as I opened my mouth. Zelma had had that voice. She had been trailed about by that machine. Zelma had been released only a few days before I came, though she had promised to return. And now there was me. I should explain right away that I didn't belong here, but that goes without saying. No one belonged here. That was the ordinary, the average, you might say the normal reaction. On W-3, you encountered the terrible force of a generalization, and it had to be resisted. The self had to be exerted. Anything to deny this grim, inert, collective state.
That's so great. She does so many things in this book that I think are really interesting. Just formally, what it popped out at me while you were reading. I mean, she's very, very interested in words and wordplay, and oftentimes she'll pile like 3 or 4 words in a row. Like when you talked about her getting her hair cut, she said something like, "My hair was clipped, shorn, sheared."
Yeah.
Skinned.
She uses a lot of synonyms. She does that often. Another thing that she does is whenever a member of staff or a doctor speaks, she puts whatever they say in all caps.
Yeah.
You know, and it doesn't always seem like they're yelling, but I guess to the patients it feels like they're yelling. But it reminded me of Charlie Brown, which is kind of the opposite way. You know, when adults speak, it's like, you know, even though it's kind of the opposite because they're in all capitals, like they're yelling, but what they say is so different. You know, they're like a different species. You know, they talk in a totally different way, which I thought was interesting. Just the way I mean, I guess that's kind of 2 things that I find interesting, that she sees the staff and the doctors as like a completely different species, but also her interest in, you know, different formal expressions in her writing.
Yeah. That was the ordinary, the average, you might say the normal reaction.
Yeah.
Yeah. The way she sort of makes you rethink each word and its connotations.
Yeah. Absolutely. If you don't mind, I'm going to read just a short paragraph from Blue in Chicago, that one of the short stories in the other book that seemed to speak to Howland's method in general, and particularly in the memoir. She was saying, I always take books with me on buses or trains. I never read them. Years ago, when I was an undergraduate at the university, I used to travel 3 hours a day on these same buses, commuting between the South Side campus and my home on the West Side. You can get all your studying done. That's what people would say. But I never got any studying done. I'd sit with a whole pile of books on my lap, looking out the window. 3 hours a day, an hour and a half each way, staring at the same sights out the same windows. I was 15 then. It's possible that all this travel was stupefying me. Still, it seems to me that there's something immoral because inattentive about reading when your body is in transit. And maybe I even felt then that I should be paying attention instead, but paying attention to what? I thought it was so interesting that she thought it was immoral to be inattentive. In W-3, her body was not in motion. She wasn't going anywhere, but it felt like she needed to be paying attention to everyone around her. Sometimes I wondered, like, how was she making any progress herself? You never really heard anything in the memoir about what she talked to the doctors about, or, it just felt like a function of time. Like if she was going to be there long enough, eventually she would feel better and leave. But really, her whole attention seemed to be focused outward.
Yes, and it's so interesting, Laurie. You said, her attention is facing outward, and yet I feel that it's so true, and that seems to me the only way for Betty to survive that is for the whole attention not to be focused on herself, because here she no longer has herself. She doesn't know who she herself is anymore, and I'm curious because I don't know her, but just the way she describes everyone I mean, it is a very special setting. Everyone lives publicly. There's no privacy on the ward. Everyone's life is on display. Yet Bette Howland, the narrator, is the most private character in the whole book. As you said, we never get, her backstories, not a lot of backstories, not a lot of progress, not a lot of her thoughts. And I thought it was a genius to turn all your attention to others, sort of either to protect yourself or to preserve yourself in that setting.
Yeah. Laurie, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm so glad you read that passage. That is one of my favorite ones in her book. And it really defines who she is as a writer. I didn't think that it was a way of being private or hidden, but that you could see most clearly if you were looking not at yourself. Yourself would sort of distract you and you'd get sort of caught in the muck, in the mire. And the other thing, and I think when the three of us had talked the other day, we were talking a little bit about the fact that she's writing about these, these are all taking place sort of in public spaces. The stories take place in a public library where she had worked, or she goes to a criminal court and has a story set in that environment, or here in the psychiatric ward. So that's sort of interesting to me too, that the environments in which she's interested in looking at people.
And I also find it interesting that she seems to approach other people really from the outside in, as opposed to some writers who approach people from the inside out. You hear what everybody is wearing and what kind of makeup they were wearing. And I thought at first, maybe that's just W-3 because all the people are obsessed with stuff because they don't really have anything. A lot of the patients show up unexpectedly. They come in through the emergency room in an ambulance. They have just whatever is on their body and they don't have any clothes to wear, and they're going around borrowing from people. So they're all obsessed with clothes and things. So therefore the narrator is. But then when I read her short stories, she's like that also with her mother and with her family, what they're wearing and what kind of makeup they're wearing. And she's very obsessed with her mother's hair in particular. I thought was very funny, her ermine head. But I just thought that was an interesting approach, you know.
Yeah. And then there are the really very rare, I think there are rare moments she would use she doesn't use metaphor or a simile or all these things. There, as you said, she described all these people and all of a sudden she said, well, this patient, she just looked like a penguin lost on an island.
Yeah.
And because it just dropped in like that, and then she would not linger with that image. And I just felt so much pain for that patient. I mean, for that one patient who looked like a lost penguin. I mean, penguins in general are very funny, but if they're lost, it's even sadder and funnier, I think.
On a different subject, I felt like Chicago is such a big presence in both of her books, even though in W-3 she's in the hospital. She talks a lot about going out on day passes and things like that. And also Chicago just sort of crowds into the hospital in the form of all the other patients. She's in a hospital, I think at the University of Chicago on the South Side. A lot of the other patients are African-American. She's a sort of middle-class white person. I wondered how you felt about her approach to race and how that played out in the book.
Yiyun, do you have?
Do I have? I think maybe I did say that, I did read that in my introduction. I feel that America is already like, it's a society full of these racial conflicts and class conflicts. And then if you put 50 people in a hospital setting, I think that's, not only maybe her experience, I think anyone who would go to this hospital, I mean, you don't have to go to the hospital, you can imagine, it's just, it's almost like it's a, how do you say that, intensified version of this society. There are people, as Laurie said, a lot of people came in, they did not have anything. They did not even have underwears. And then there are patients who came in with 7 suitcases of, jewelries and clothes. And of course, what you eat every day or what you refuse to eat also shows I guess the gap between people. There's one moment when towards the end of the book, when this African-American woman who worked in the hospital, who was the aunt of her friend who came to see Bette Howland. And she told this story. I thought it was, another Chicago bus story. So this woman said she was traveling on a bus and someone came in with a big giant scythe onto the bus. And it seems that everybody would be killed by this person carrying this thing. And people were all making ways not to get hurt. And this older African-American woman and the auntie who told the story is that you can see she works as a maid. She just took out the little pistol very quietly and just put the pistol on her lap and sort of saying, that muzzle is the finger or sort of the extension of her finger. And this man with this big scythe, look at the pistol, just went away. And then Bette said, after a long time, or after a long time, I realized how important that woman told this story to her. And this woman told Bette, said, if someone wants your wallet, just give it to her. Don't fight. Give it to him. I don't know. I feel that it's something. It's there all the time in the book, and yet I think what's interesting to me is, no matter where they came from, they all seem to be trapped in a space or in a place actually a little bit different from where they came from. The man who was trying to kill himself had to hold his arm the whole time because he didn't want to, he didn't want the wound to open. And it's I mean, to me, it's just a very interesting place to see all the factors in the society play out, even 100 times more absurd and more intense and more interesting way. if that makes sense.
I do think Chicago is one of the great subjects of her work. There's a wonderful interview with Studs Terkel on there. They have an archive, a website with his interviews, and there's a great conversation with the two of them
Oh, I'd love to hear that.
talking about Chicago.
I think we should ask for questions. I think it's time to
Okay.
Any questions.
Do we? Oh,
How do we? Does anyone have questions in the chat, or Maris? Is there a separate question area?
There are questions in the chat. From Amy Danzer, she says, "Greetings from Chicago. Whenever I see a Chicago author reach beyond our city, beyond the Midwest, I'm so thrilled, but also curious about what about it resonates with readers beyond Blue Chicago. Would love to hear your thoughts on her reach, and thank you, A Public Space, for bringing her work back into the light."
You know, I just want to, it's not a great answer to Amy's question, but I actually just saw on Twitter about W-3, and I mentioned to Brigid, someone said she was an undergraduate in UC Berkeley in the 1970s. And
UC Chicago.
No, this
person
was from Berkeley, and she said, I was at Berkeley in the late 1970s, and I was the generation feeling lost. And we all heard of this book, W-3, but there was just a lot of whispers. We just had to whisper about the book. Back then there was no internet. Nobody could search for this book. So I thought that's an interesting question about, how the book did not go or went from Chicago to the rest of the country, but
yeah.
I don't know.
This story collection was published in the UK for the first time this summer. It was the first time her books had been published over there. And I think there's a feeling, and perhaps in this country, but certainly outside of this country, that Chicago is sort of the quintessential American city. And it's sort of, if you look at the stories of Chicago, you're looking at all of the issues that define this country.
Mm-hmm.
Heather Wolf says, "Did her son or any of her correspondents shed any light on why she stopped publishing?"
Her son, Jacob, who has been the person who sort of pulled all of this work together and helped to publish these books. He thinks that it was, that the MacArthur sort of was this honor, the sort of that to live up to, and that it sort of imposed a pressure on her work that influenced her ability to feel a piece was finished and ready to be published. And I wanted to look, we published a small portfolio of her letters to Saul Bellow that she wrote in the year when she won the MacArthur. And so I'm sort of tempted to read a whole bunch of sections from them, but there's one that she says, "Lately I've been sort of scooped out by a realization of how lonely I've been, and for such a long time. I didn't really know it was lonely, and for sure I didn't need to be. I'll probably go on being too. I would remind you too, in our line of business, we get many chances. I tell people I'm not a writer, I'm a rewriter. They must think this is a criticism. It's not. You get second chances. It's never too late. Stop the presses. I thought of a better word. Almost the right one." She says, "A doctor once told me my semi-paralysis was nicknamed in the profession perfectionist disease. I'm not a perfectionist," I said. "That's my work." I think she demanded a lot of herself and of her writing, but it is a little bit of a mystery.
Therese says, hate myself for asking, but what, if anything, did Bellow say about her publicly? I know there's that amazing blurb that you saw, Brigid.
Yes. The blurb is, he says, he calls her one of the significant writers of her generation. He was a tremendous, from the material, the archival material I've seen, he was a tremendous advocate of her work, both before she published her books and later on in her career.
Tom Beer says, what kind of critical reception did she have at the time these books came out originally?
The books, there are some really tremendous reviews of her books when they first published in the late 70s and 80s. They were quite well received. Sort of as an interesting historical side note, Gordon Lish was the editor for one of her collections.
Oh. Did he ever say anything about her?
Yes, a little bit, but everyone maybe sees this in the chat, but Betty's first cousin is here and says the conventional family wisdom was that Betty was crippled by a combination of her awful experience with publishers and the pressure of the MacArthur grant.
Amazing.
Now I want to know more about her awful experience with publishers.
Dorothy asks, have her sons or personal friends talked about her as a mother or a friend? Her writing makes me wonder about her interpersonal relationships.
Yes, and I will. Yes, they have. Her son Jacob Howland has written about a few essays about his mother, and I wish I had the links at hand to put in the chat box. There are her sons make a few sort of fleeting mentions of her sons in W-3, and I think they're just really some of the most touching and painful moments in the book.
There's also, when we first published the letters, I think Jacob also wrote a beautiful piece about, by then, I think Betty already suffered from dementia.
Yes.
And they would sit together and they would read Betty's old work together to her. So I thought that was quite a touching moment of, towards the end of her life.
Yeah.
Someone asks, did she ever write about having multiple sclerosis, which her New York Times obituary mentions that she had? Have you seen anything, Brigid?
I don't think she did. I don't think she did. No. I'm trying to think if in any of her later stories it's mentioned fleetingly, but I don't recall.
When I read Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, the last couple of stories took place, I'm not sure exactly where, but not in Chicago. And they just seemed so weird. It seemed so weird to see her in a different setting and in what was clearly a rural setting.
Yeah.
And I think she must have lived in places like that for quite a long time, but it just seemed so unlike her after having gotten to know her through the earlier work.
Oh. Didn't she at one time live on an island?
She did. She lived on Peaks Island, Maine, I believe. She lived in settings very much that were not Chicago for most of her adult life. Very, often very rural settings.
Just to make sure you all see this, that Maureen says her first book had glowing reviews and the publisher didn't have enough copies in print and distribute enough to keep up with demand.
No.
And Nicole Dewey has posted a link with Brigid's conversation with Jacob Howland. So you can check that out. Any further questions?
Well, one thing, if we have another minute and no one else has any questions, one thing that I wanted to ask you too about that we didn't talk about before is just her sense of humor. she's writing a memoir about being in a psychiatric institution, and these short stories about, there are just a lot of public institutional settings, as you said before, Brigid, a library, a courthouse, but she just has such a sense of humor. How do you think she accomplishes that, or, what does it add to it?
Well, Brigid, you can add. I'm just going to start. I laughed so much when I was reading W-3. I think partly the sense of humor is, I think she recognized that absurdities are also so universal. Everybody is absurd. We talk about people are absurd, but it's not unusual. It's not rare. Everybody is absurd in the same way. And I think she seemed to be able to capture that. I remember a moment when the doctors came in to sit down at the meeting. The doctors would part their robe like tails before they before they would sit down. And I just thought, well, we probably have seen those doctors doing that 1,000 times, but she was the only one to really to part the tails, these doctors. And she sees those moments, and I think the humor is really within, it's with everyday little details, and she just presents to you and you realize how funny it is. And then of course the absurd, the patients have to sit, have to do these elections too, right? It's really like Alice in Wonderland, that caucus race. Nobody knows what they're doing. Everybody's running around like crazy. And in the end, whoever got elected would not want to take the job. And so it's that, well, it's not quite different from the world we know now. There's no normal world, but I think she sees that, and she writes seriously. And I mean, she takes these absurdities seriously. She doesn't laugh at these moments. She doesn't laugh at the characters. I think the way she takes them seriously and presents them as though there's nothing to laugh about or to laugh at, I think that it's the good humor for me.
Very true.
Yeah. Well, this has been so great. Is there anything else that either of you would like to say about Bette that we haven't gotten to?
No, you read some of my favorite quotes, and I'm glad that we didn't end without talking about her sense of humor and her way of seeing the world.
It's wonderful. I just want to say I love the book so much. I'm I'm so in awe, and also feeling a little competitive.
I keep turning to the book and wanting to open up and read another passage of her work. But this was a real treat. And for me to have Yiyun and Bette sort of together in one book was wonderful.
Oh, I like Maureen said she was brilliant and sassy and sensitive. Isn't it nice? 3 adjectives.
It is so nice to hear from someone who knew her and adored her.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, McNally Jackson, for the event and for keeping us supplied with books all year.
Thank you. And please, W-3 is for sale, McNallyJackson.com. The book is wonderful. Please buy it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Right.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.